Section 27 of John Inglesant, A Romance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. John Inglesant, A Romance by Joseph Henry Shorthouse. Chapter 18. Shortly after the conversation recorded in the previous chapter, Inglesant, who appeared completely restored to health, thanks to the Baron van Helmont and to rest of body, left Oulton, and without going to London, went to Rye and sailed thence to France, where he arrived about the middle of May, 1651. He had taken a passage in a vessel, sailing to Dieppe, and from thence he posted to Paris, this route being thought much safer than the one through Calais, which was much infested by robbers. He found Paris full of the fugitive royalists in a state of distress and destitution, which was so great that on the Queen of England's going to Saint-Germain on one occasion, her creditors threatened to arrest her coach. The young King Charles was in Scotland, previous to his march into England, which terminated in the Battle of Worcester. Inglesant was well received by the royalists, to whom he made himself known on his arrival. The Glamorgan negotiations were by this time pretty well understood among the royalists, and Inglesant's conduct fairly well appreciated. He had the reputation of being a useful and trustworthy agent, and as such was well received by the heads of the party. He presented himself at the Louvre, where the Queen was, who received him graciously, and expressed a wish that he would remain in Paris, as she had been speaking not many days ago with Father St. Clair concerning him. Inglesant inquired where the Jesuit was, and was told at Saint-Germain's with the French court, and that he would be in Paris again shortly. After leaving the Queen, Inglesant applied to the merchants with whom his money was to have been lodged, but found that by some misunderstanding a much smaller sum had arrived than he had expected. Such as it was, however, he was able from it to make advances to the royalist gentlemen, many of whom of the highest rank were in absolute distress, and he even advanced a considerable sum indirectly to the Queen, and through the Duke of Ormond to the young Duke of Gloucester. It is not necessary to enter into any details with regard to the state of France or the French court at that time. The court had been obliged to leave Paris some time before, owing to the violence of the populace, and was at present much embarrassed from the same cause. It was therefore quite unable to afford any help to the distressed fugitives from England, had it wished to do so, and even the Queen Henrietta, a daughter of France, could scarcely obtain assistance, and was reduced to the greatest pecuniary distress. The Duke of Ormond parted with his last jewel to procure money for the use of the Duke of Gloucester, whose guardian he was, and the inferior royalists were reduced to still greater necessities. No sooner, therefore, was it known that Inglesant had means at his disposal than he became once more a person of the greatest consequence, and every one sought him out, or if not before acquainted with him, desired an introduction. He frequented the chapel of Sir Richard Browne, who had been ambassador from Charles I, and still retained his privileges, his chapel and his household being accredited from the young fugitive king to the French court. This was the only Anglican place of worship in Paris, or indeed at that time perhaps in the world. Ordinations were performed there, and it was frequented by the king and the two young princes, the Duke of York and the Duke of Gloucester, and by all the royalist fugitives then in Paris. Inglesant was the more welcome, as many of the royalist gentlemen who had any money at all refused to stay in Paris, where there were so many claims upon them, but went on to other countries, especially Italy. He found many of these gentlemen in a very excited state, owing to the efforts of the Queen Mother to discourage the English Church and to win over perverts to Romanism. The king and the duke, it is true, received the sacrament in the ambassador's chapel, partaking of it together before the other communicants, Lord Byron, Inglesant's old friend, and Lord Wilmot, holding a white cloth before the two princes, but the queen mother was making every effort to pervert the young Duke of Gloucester, and throwing all the weight of her influence and patronage on the side of the papists. Several of the maids of honour had been discharged shortly before Inglesant's arrival in Paris for refusing to conform to the Romish mass. Dr. Cousin, the Dean of Peterborough, a profound ritualist, but at the same time devoted to the Anglican Church, had preached a sermon in the chapel comforting and supporting these ladies. Inglesant, being with the Queen at the Palais Royal one morning as she was going to her private mass, was commanded to accompany her, and upon his readily complying, the Queen afterwards spoke to him on the subject of religion, inquiring why he, who had so long been so closely connected with the Catholic Church, did not become one of its members. Inglesant pleaded that the Jesuit Father St. Clair had discouraged him from joining the Papists, as not convenient in the position in which he had been placed. The Queen said that the reasons which actuated the father did not any longer exist, but that she would wait till she could take his advice, in the meantime requesting Inglesant to attend the Romish services as much as possible, which he promised to do. As a matter of choice he preferred the English communion to the Mass, but he regarded both as means of sacramental grace, and endeavoured at low Mass to bring his mind into the same devout stillness and condition of adoration as at a communion. It would appear that about this time he must have been formally received into the Romish Church, for he confessed and received the sacrament at low Mass, but no mention of the ceremony occurs, and it is possible that the priests received instructions respecting him, while there is clear proof that he attended the services at the ambassador's chapel, and once at any rate partook of the sacrament there. Here he met with Mr. Hobbes, who expressed himself pleased to see him, and entered into long discourses with him respecting the Glamorgan negotiations and the late king's policy generally, discourses which were very instructive to Inglesant, though he felt a greater repugnance to the man than when he formerly met him in London. The religious thoughts which had filled Inglesant's mind at Oulton were far from forgotten, and when he arrived in Paris his first feeling had been one of dissatisfaction at finding himself at once involved again in political intrigue, but his affection for the Jesuit, apart from his desire to discover the Italian by his means, made him desire to meet him, and he continued in Paris, waiting with this intention, when an event occurred which altogether diverted his thoughts. He spent his time in many ways, partly in acts of religion, partly in studies, frequenting several lectures, both in letters and in science, such as Mons, as Monsieur Fabuse's course of chemistry. He also frequented the tennis court in the Rue Verdelet, where the King of England and the princes and nobles both of that country and of France amused themselves. He had been at this latter place one morning, and something having happened to prevent the gentleman who had arranged to play the match from appearing, Inglesant, who was a good tennis player, had been requested to take his place against Monsieur Saumur, the great French player. There was a large and brilliant attendance to watch the play, and Inglesant exerted himself to the utmost, so much so that he earned the applause and thanks of the company for the brilliant match played before them. Having at last been beaten, which occurred probably when the great player considered he had afforded sufficient amusement to the spectators, Inglesant turned to leave the court, having resumed his dress and sword, when he was accosted by an English nobleman whom he very slightly knew, who, no doubt influenced by the applause and attention which Inglesant had excited, asked him to dine with him at a neighbouring place of entertainment. After dinner the gentleman told Inglesant that he was in the habit, together with many other English who wished to perfect their knowledge of French, of resorting to one or other of the convents of Paris to talk with the ancient sisters whose business it was to receive strangers, and had several such acquaintances with whom he might chat at the grates, for the nuns speak a quaint dialect, and have besides most commonly all the news that passes, which they are ready to discourse upon as long as you choose to listen, whereby you gain a greater knowledge of the most correct and refined manner of speaking of all manner of common and trifling events that you could otherwise gain. He said that he had received a parcel of English gloves and knives from England the day before, some of which he intended that afternoon taking to one of his devota, as they call a friend in a convent, he said, in Spain, and would take Inglesant with him if the latter wished to come. Inglesant willingly consented, and they went to a convent of the in the Rue des Terres Fortes. They found the ancient nun, a little courtly old lady, as amusing and pleasant as they expected, and she was on her part apparently equally pleased with Lord Cheyne's presence and with Inglesant's courteous discourse in good French. She invited Inglesant to visit her again, but the next day he received a message which was brought by a servant of the convent, who had found his lodgings with some difficulty through Lord Cheyne, requesting him to come to the convent at once. It lay in a retired and rather remote part of the city, and but for his friend's introduction he would never have visited it. Thinking the message somewhat strange, he complied with the request, and in the afternoon found himself again in the convent parlour. The nun came immediately to the grate. "Ah, monsieur," she said, "I'm glad that you are come. You think it strange, doubtless, that I should send for you so soon, but I spoke of you last night to an inmate of this house, who is a compatriot of yours, and who, I'm sorry to say, is very ill. Nay, I fear at the point of death. And she told me she had known you very well, very well indeed, in times past, and she entreated me to send to you if I could find out your residence. I only knew of you through Milord Cheyne, but I sent to him." "What is this lady's name, madame?" said Inglesant, who even then did not guess who it was. "Ah, her name," said the nun, "her name is Colette, Mademoiselle Marie Colette." She had the door in the grate open for Inglesant, and took him through the house and past a court planted with trees to a small and quiet room overlooking the distant woodlands. There upon a little bed, her face white, her hands and form wasted to a shadow, only her wonderful eyes the same as ever, lay Mary Colette, her face lighting up and her weak hands trembling as he came in. On his knees by the bedside, his face buried in his hands, her white fingers playing over his hair, Inglesant could not speak, dare not even look up. The old nun looked on kindly for some few minutes, and then left them. Mary was the first to speak, and as she spoke, Inglesant raised his head and fixed his eyes on hers, keeping down the torrent of grief that all but mastered him as he might. She spoke to him of her joy at seeing him, she so lonely and lost in a foreign land, separated from all her friends and family, not knowing indeed where they were, of the sufferings and hardship she had passed through since they had left Gidding, hardships which had caused the fever of which she lay dying as she spoke. She had come to Paris after parting from her uncle in Brittany, where they had suffered much deprivation with the Lady Blunt, and had been received into this convent, where she had meant to take the veil. But the fever grew upon her, and the physicians at last gave her no hope of recovery. There she had lain, day after day, tended by the kind nuns with every care, yet growing weaker and more weary, longing for some voice or face of her own country or of former days. While she had been well enough to listen, the nuns had told her all the little scraps of news relating to her own countrymen and to the Queen which had reached them, but Inglesant's arrival was not likely to be among these, and Mary had heard nothing of his being in Paris till the night before, when the kindly old nun, finding her a little better than usual, had thought to amuse her by speaking of the pleasant young Englishman who spoke French so well, and whose half-foreign name she could easily remember, and who Lord Cheyne had told her had been one of the most faithful servants of the poor murdered king. The start of the dying girl before her, her flushed face as she raised herself in bed and threw herself into her friend's arms, entreating her that this old friend, the dearest friend she had ever known, dearer now than ever, might be sent for at once while she had life and strength to speak to him, showed the nun that this was yet again a reacting of that old story that never tires a woman's heart. The nuns were not strict, far from it, and even had Mary already taken the veil, the sisters would have thought little blame of her, even for remembering that once she dreamt of another bridegroom than the heavenly spouse. The nun had promised to send early in the morning to Lord Cheyne, who no doubt knew the abode of his friend, and Mary, as she finished telling all this in her low and weak speech, lay still and quiet, looking upon her friend almost with as calm and peaceful a glance of her absorbing eyes as when she had looked at him in the garden parlour at Gidding years ago. He himself said little. It was not his words she wanted, could he have spoken them. That he was there by her, looking up in her face, holding her hand, was quite enough. At last she said, "And that mission to the Papist murderers, Johnny, you did not wish to bring them into England of your own accord, or only as a plot of the Jesuits? Surely you were but the servant of one whom you could not discover." "I had the king's own commission for all I did, for every word I said," said Inglesant eagerly, "a commission written by himself and signed in my presence, which he gave me himself. That was the paper the Lord Byron would not burn." "I knew it must be so, Johnny. My uncle told me it must be so. It seems to me you have served a hard master, though you do not complain. We heard about the scaffold at Charing Cross. Will you serve your heavenly Master as well as you have served your King?" "I desire to serve him, am seeking to serve him even now, but I do not find the way. Tell me how I can serve him, Mary, and I swear to you I will do whatever you shall say." "He must teach you, Johnny, not I. I doubt not that you follow him now, will serve him hereafter much better than I could ever show you, could ever do myself. Whatever men may think of the path you have already chosen, no one can say you have not walked in it steadily to the end. Only walk in this way as steadily, Johnny. Only follow your heart as unflinchingly when it points you to him." "I will do nothing night and day while I live, Johnny, but pray to Jesus that he may lead you to himself." The old familiar glamour that shed such a holy radiance on the woods and fields of Gidding now, to Inglesant's senses, filled the little convent room. The light of heaven that entered the open window with the perfume of the hawthorn was lost in the diviner radiance that shone from this girl's face into the depths of his being, and bathed the place where she was in light. His heart ceased to beat, and he lay, as in a trance, to behold the glory of God. End of section 27.